He only got and said it. It was strawberry blonde. That took a lot of persuasion to move from ginger to strawberry blonde, so thanks for that, Les. Whatever you do, don't pull that handle, that lever, sorry. Neil, you need to listen to me. Whatever you do, don't pull that lever. It was the first thing that was said to me when I arrived in my first fast jet flying squadron. Indeed, it was the first thing that was ever said to any budding fast jet pilot that arrived at RAF Linton-on-Ouse. The lever I'm talking about is the emergency shutdown lever on the RAF Tucano, which is in the picture behind me. And it did exactly what it said in the tin. It shut down the engine in the most quickest, most efficient manner by cutting the fuel and cutting the igniters to the engine. I guess the problem with the lever was its position. It sat in behind the seat, and it had the same size, feel, positioning as another lever, which we had to use on a daily basis, the flap lever. And when you consider the amount of kit we had on, we had helmets, we had microphones, we had oxygen masks, we had life-saving jerkins, sometimes we had additional equipment, it was almost impossible to find and identify this lever. And in actual fact, the lever that we wanted to use on a daily basis was a little bit harder to reach than the one that we should never touch under any circumstances. Now, I can already tell that you guys think that I'm going to tell a story about an occasion when somebody pulled that lever, and you're absolutely right. I just want to make one thing clear. It wasn't me that pulled it. So when you arrive on a squadron, one of the first things that you need to do, and when you learn to fly a plane, as you would expect, is you need to be able to take the thing off, and you need to put the thing back on the ground. And typically you're taught to do this all at once in an exercise called circuits. And there's circuits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And basically you become really proficient in taking the aircraft off and landing the aircraft. I guess one of the problems with circuits is that it's one of the early courses or one of the early lessons that you take. And there's a huge amount going on. You're trying to fly an aircraft, for one. You're trying to fly within a really tight geographic space. And you've got a huge amount of other stuff on your mind. You've got to fly the aircraft first and foremost. You've got to worry about speed. You've got to worry about altitude. You've got to worry about positioning. You've got to worry about other aircraft. You've got to worry about air traffic control. You've got to worry about wind. And you've got to worry about the instructor who's nagging you day in, day out in the back. And one day, one of my colleagues took off to do Circuits 1 with a relatively new instructor. And things weren't going so well. All the things that I mentioned to you were starting to get on top of him. And he started to run out of mental capacity. So he was on his final circuit, and he was about 500 feet, just about to land on the airstrip for the final time and go for a cup of tea and just try and forget all about it. At which point his instructor says, "Don't forget the flaps." So of course we all know where the flap lever is, and in his panic and his state of overwhelm and his state of kind of stress, he reached round and pulled the first handle that came to mind, or came to hand rather. And of course it was the emergency shutdown lever. And the engine shut down. So we're at 500 feet, and the aircraft started to, it literally just points towards the ground because you've lost thrust, you're starting to lose the lift. Luckily the instructor was really on top of his game, and he was able to restart the engine. And when you don't land, you go around. They went around at 50 feet, each with one hand on the ejection handle. So for me, that's a really kind of practical and personal experience of how human factors is so important. And it's not just an opportunity to show a plane and then tell an old war story, which as an ex-pilot doesn't take a huge amount of persuasion, I have to say. But more, it illustrates the point that regardless of how competent we are, regardless of how well qualified and how experienced we are, the environment in which we work in and the tools and the equipment in which we use heavily influence our ability to perform in a variety of circumstances.
To the secret lab! Pull the lever, Gronk. Wrong lever!
Huh?
Why do we even have that lever? Get out of my way.
Okay, why does she even have that lever?
So that's a little bit of a funny clip, but to me it really illustrates that I bet there's not a single person in this room who's done something under a little bit of pressure, under a little bit of time constraint, or just with their mind on something else, and pushed the wrong button, pulled the wrong lever. Oh, thank you. Case in point. And that wasn't rehearsed. Who have pushed the wrong lever, pulled the wrong button, and just done something that they didn't mean to do because of the environment they were operating in. And I thought to myself, what a stupid place to put that. So I want to make 2 points just before we move on. I guess the first point that I want to make is that human factors is so much more than behavioural safety, which I think, again, judging on straw polls, is a common misconception. And the reason I say that is that human factors looks at the scope of our environment, including behaviour, education, training and experience, but it allows us to look at so much more, such as the environment we work in, the people that we work with, the equipment that we interface with. And the reason that I say it's not solely about behavioural safety is that if we think back to my earlier example, no amount of education, no amount of training, no amount of behavioural safety or coaching would have prevented my friend and colleague from pulling that lever, because the environment that he was in and the equipment that he was dealing with simply almost encouraged pulling that lever. So human factors allows us to consider the whole spectrum of things, the interaction of man and his environment. And I'd like to take the opportunity over the next kind of 10, 15 minutes to share with you some of the experiences that I think are most important to human factors, which Tom will pick up later on and talk to within the tool, and how we feel that we've helped address these issues, or will help you guys address these issues through the tool and the progression from first steps. So there's a lot of definitions of human factors out there, but I'd like to keep it simple. I like to consider human factors as the way in which man interacts with the environment. And the environment can include a lot of things. It can include other people, it can include equipment, it can include software, hardware, computers, even the seats and levers and things that we pull. So what can we do about it, and what are the simple things that we can do to help address human factors? Well, first and foremost for me, I think it's important that we understand, or we help other people understand, the environments in which they're entering into. As you can see, this guy has absolutely no idea what he's just stepped into. His primal focus is to get a good photo, and has absolutely no idea what he's walked into. But simple things like safety critical communication that's conducted effectively and well, and checks understanding of the people that's been in the communication party, signs or barriers, anything that we can do across the board in a simple manner in order to help people understand what environment they're looking into, what environment they're entering into, what environment we're asking them to work and play in. So again, it's another kind of funny clip, and many of you have probably seen that before, but and I've seen that 100 times before. But when I see it, every time I think about the guy in the night shift applying an isolation when he's understimulated, he's done the thing 100 times before, he's not particularly interested in what he's doing because his state of arousal is he's understimulated, is in an apathetic state, it's the middle of the night, he's got other things on his mind, and when he approaches the equipment, everything looks the same. And again, no amount of training, competence, or coaching can really affect that. The environment is almost inviting a mistake. The other 2 points I'd like to touch upon there is, we mentioned kind of middle of the night. This guy's obviously rushing to get to work, something he's done 100 times before. And there was an advert for coffee at the end there, I think. So circadian rhythms, when do we ask people to do work? You know, when are we asking people to do safety critical maintenance at 2 o'clock in the morning when they're at their natural low? And what kind of state of arousal are we expecting people to be in when we go and ask them to do simple or stressful tasks? In the Air Force, for example, we stopped all safety critical maintenance in the middle of the night shift because it was just, we knew that regardless of how well trained the guys were, regardless of how well stimulated they were, the human body was pre-exposed to making mistakes at that time of the day. Complexity. I guess this one is one close to my heart. This is a picture of the shuttle, and there's obviously a need for complexity in some situations. But I think just simple things that we could all make a difference in terms of the consideration of the level of complexity required in order for the user to do their jobs. And some would say that there's almost, from designers and creators of systems such as this, and I've experienced this firsthand, is there's almost a pride at stake whereby designers, engineers, and people who develop these systems want to engineer in complexity because it shows their product off better. It shows how clever, how complex, how sophisticated their product is, and how much it can do, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And you see this in aircraft systems all the time. And they fail to consider that somebody's got to use this at the end of the day. And that, in actual fact, engineering in complexity could be directly correlated to engineering in opportunities for human error. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we come to my end example. So what other things can we do? And what other things does the tool pick up on? Well, signs, we kind of touched upon that when we spoke about the environment. Signs are probably the easiest and most simplest way to convey information in a good way or a bad way. This was really just a quick Google search, but very quickly you can get a feel for how productive or how unproductive signs can be. And working from left to right, or left, right, and then the bottom, the picture of the road sign here, very simple sign, very recognizable, but just displays completely the wrong information. And we think about, okay, it looks simple here, it's a nice clear day, and you can see the road clearly bending round to the left-hand side. But I'd happily stake some money on the fact that somebody driving along who aren't familiar with the area, maybe the weather's poor, it's dark, the kids are screaming in the back, and they look for a sign that's familiar, they know exactly what it's telling them, and they plough off to the right-hand side. The overuse of signs and overcomplication of signs and information available to us. No pets allowed, all pets must be on a leash, directly contradicts each other in trying to convey some sort of message. Again, it's just an extra thing for an individual to use which might tip them over the edge in terms of mental capacity. And I put the McDonald's sign here because signs don't necessarily have to be complex. In fact, they don't even have to contain words. Simple kind of geometric shapes and colours or a brand or sign can tell 99% of your target audience exactly what they need to know and when they need to know it. So before I move on to my final example, I wanted to share with you some of the work that we've done here at Nexon in terms of incorporating some of the human factors aspects we've touched upon on the last few slides. And some of you may have seen this at the Piper 25 conference. In the mix there's a guy with a white helmet on and a blue boiler suit. And I'll give you a couple of seconds to try and find him. It's obviously a really busy slide. There's lots going on. There's lots of similarity. There's lots of colours. And the guy that I'm talking about is really difficult to spot. And I guess one of the things I wanted to touch upon in this slide is that human factors, there are some hard and fast rules, and there's some kind of rooms for manoeuvre. And I think it all comes down to consideration of the user. In this case, colour overcomplicated things and made it very difficult for somebody to understand what they were looking for. And when we think about this in the context of alarms or displays or warnings, then we want people to understand the information that they need to understand as quickly and as concisely as possible, so that the action they take on the back of that is crisp, clean, and appropriate. And we could have actually made this a little bit harder. We could have put the guy down to the bottom right, because it's human instinct to start reading from left to right, top to bottom. So this is an example from one of the buzzard displays. And again, tying it back to the first slide I showed you a second ago, it's quite complex. There's a lot of colours going on, there's a lot of information, and there are actually some more, I mean, it's all valid information, but there's some pieces of information in there that we really want the operator or user to find. So one of the projects at Nexon looked at rationalising the alarms and making it more user-friendly, and the introduction of a kind of grayscale model. And through the simple introduction of grayscale models, you can already see that the information that you're required to see, your eyes instantly drawn to. And a trained, competent operator would have so much more capacity to deal with what he's being told in a clearer manner, because he's not having to sift through a whole load of noise. So I wanted to kind of finish off with a kind of more serious example. We've had a look at some funny little clips and some ideas of where and how I think that we can target the tool that Tom will introduce later on. But I wanted to finish on a more serious example of how human factors can come together in a really kind of, well, a devastating effect, really. And it's something that's actually quite close to my heart. Les mentioned that I was involved in working with the Australian Air Force and bringing into service an air-to-air refuelling platform. Well, the air-to-air refuelling platform was actually a modified Airbus A330, which is what Air France 447 was. So I'm going to refer to my notes just a little bit more, just because I want to get this right. And it's going to be a very abridged version of the kind of chain of events. And I'll give you some of my personal examples of how I think human factors played an absolutely critical role in the accident that was Air France 447. So to give you a bit of a background, Air France 447 was flying from Rio de Janeiro to Paris, standard flight. Yet for some reason, the 1st of June 2009, it literally flew into the sea, killing all 228 people on board. And before we go any further, it's worth noting, again, looking at this behavioural piece and training and expertise, the crew was incredibly competent, incredibly experienced. In fact, they had over 20,000 combined flying hours. Yet because the trigger of a technical failure and the combination of a lack of understanding effectively from the pilots meant that they flew a perfectly serviceable, there was nothing wrong with the aircraft, and they flew it into the sea, sorry. All systems were running, everything was up and running, and it flew into the sea. And there was a documentary on about this a few days ago, actually. Some of you may have seen it. But some of the kind of human factors aspects at play here was that the Airbus 330 is probably one of the most advanced complex systems in the planet, which is great when everything's up and running. But when we think about how the user interprets that information, then it starts to introduce some problems. And on a typical 11-hour flight, the pilots only fly the aircraft for 4 minutes. So they take the aircraft off, they click the autopilot in, and then at 500 feet, they take the autopilot out and they land it. So they're only actually getting 4 minutes of flying on an 11-hour flight, and there's 3 of them. There's 3 pilots on board, and they fly maybe 3 or 4 times a month. So you can see that the hands-on ability to fly the aircraft, or skill fade, could play a significant part in this. But effectively what happened was they flew into storm clouds, and some of the sensors that give them airspeed started to freeze up. And the emergency procedure for loss of airspeed indication is literally to do nothing. Don't touch anything. Yet for some reason, the first officer pulled back on the stick. And the aircraft started to climb, And the aircraft started to climb to the point that it got so high that it couldn't generate any more lift. And it started to lose speed. So at that point, the aircraft literally kind of started to fall towards the ground like this. There was no lift being generated, and the rate of descent went through the roof. And the guys simply couldn't understand what was going on. The instruments were all up and running at this stage, but because they were so disorientated, something called the startle effect, their safety critical communications just went out the box. Their procedural adherence went out the box, and they were in a complete state of panic because the environment they were working in did not lend itself to making good decisions. So one of the areas that I think is heavily related to this accident in human factors is that Airbus made the decision to move from a yoke, which you've all have seen on the movies, a big Boeing yoke, to a side stick. And they did this because the pilots would have more room in front of them and they could put more instrumentation in. But one of the problems was that in a yoke in a Boeing, when the captain moves the stick, the first officer's stick's moved, and vice versa. And that there's no ambiguity at all of what the control inputs to the aircraft are. So Airbus, through a kind of step of complexity, if you like, moved all of this to a side stick. So the guy sitting on the right had it on the right, the guy sitting on the left had it on the left, and the jump seat sat in between the two of them. But the ramifications of a simple design change was that nobody knew what inputs anybody was putting into the aircraft. And when the event started to unfold, and the captain, who was sleeping at this stage, he was taking his rest break, arrived in the cockpit, he couldn't fathom out why they were still losing speed, why they were at such a noseye attitude, and why they were plummeting towards the ground. And later they found out, when the black boxes were recovered, that when the first officer first lost his airspeed indication, he pulled back on the stick, and he pulled back on the stick for the entire duration of the rest of the flight. And that, to me, just through a simple design change and a simple change of the environment, combined with a lack of communication, safety critical communication, a lack of procedural adherence, and as they said in the final report, in this extremely deteriorated cockpit environment, the pilots, who had thousands and thousands of hours experience, were unable to rescue the aircraft. So I'd like to close or summarise by saying that I hope I've given you a good idea of how important human factors is and how it's not necessarily all about behavioural safety. And I'll hand over to Tom and later on, who will tell us how we have tried to capture some of these points in the human factors tool and put the power back into your guys' hands to make some difference in your business units, companies, departments. But before I close, I'd like to make one final point. People make mistakes. We're never ever going to get away from that. And no amount of training, education, coaching will prevent that from being true. Human factors gives us the opportunity to look at the environment that people work in, whether it's people, other people, safety equipment, mental capacity. But human factors gives us the opportunity to look at the environment that people work in and try and identify and reduce the opportunities for human error, and therefore reduce the opportunity for further accidents and incidents, such as Air France 447. Thank you very much.